Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a showdown between French hitmen when I put Jean-Pierre Melville's Les Samourai against Luc Besson's Leon the Professional. And man, this was one badass one to get through because I mean, both of these movies are stone cold badassery that only the French could deliver. And I know what you're thinking. You know, French and badass usually don't get put together, but you know what? After the Americans and the British, the French have some pretty good fucking gangster movies. And let's not forget, they basically invented film noir. You know, if you really want to like go back to the roots of cinema, film noir was invented the moment that Jean Renoir made La Bête Humaine, you know, and maybe even further back than that with La Chaine, you know, the bitch, roughly translated into English, you know, because of course I don't speak French that fucking good, so if I'm mispronouncing shit, you know what, feel free to give me a fucking French lesson in the comments. I don't really care, but one thing I do know is cinema. So let's start it off with Jean-Pierre Melville's Les Samouraïs, you know, which basically translates to the samurai. And of course, if you're not familiar with Jean-Pierre Melville, he's a French director that did a lot of gangster movies. It was kind of his forte. You know, he did other types of movies, but he's most notable for doing gangster movies. And they kind of had a slower style to him, usually with silent badasses like Jean-Paul Belmondo. And in this one, Alain Delon. And of course, Alain Delon, you know, he was one of like the kind of the sex symbols of European cinema through the 60s and 70s, you know, and he was a, you know, definitely, you know, sleek, cool, sexy type dude, you know, and also worked a lot better when he didn't say much. That's why he's so brilliant in this movie. Of course, he plays a hitman, you know, and of course, it's the whole where the samurai thing comes in, and, you know, and he pulls a job, and it, you know, then it becomes a thing because then he gets arrested and they hold him, and now the people that hired him will double cross him because now he's a liability because the film itself is pretty basic, but you know, one thing that the French did well was take basic ass plots and storylines and make them interesting by, you know, presenting them in a different way. You know, that opening sequence is like, you know, it's mostly silent for like maybe the first 10-15 minutes of the movie, you know, and of course Alain Delon doesn't say much in the movie. Of course, he's got his trench coat and his little fucking fedora or whatever the hell that kind of hat is called. And you know, he's a pretty cool cat, you know, and he definitely seems to be the smartest one in the fucking movie, even though he gets fucking, you know, shot down at the end by the cops. You know, of course, you got a hard ass inspector who's like really trying to nail this motherfucker, and like, you know, and of course there's always a love interest. It's a fucking French movie. There's gonna be some sultry gal waiting in the wings and stuff, which is also like his alibi and shit. And of course, there's that fucking lounge pianist that's really hot. You know, like she saw the motherfucker shoot the guy at the beginning, and you know she kind of lies for him and shit. And that becomes a thing. And then he's supposed to kill her at the end of the movie, and then that's when the cops gun him down. And you know they make a note of saying, you know, without us you'd been fucking dead. You know, because they, you know, they knew something was up. You know, so there's definitely a lot of stuff, and the way the action is shot in this film is very well done, you know, because it's like you see it and you don't type thing, you know, like in that scene on the fucking like bridge where that dude's about to double cross Alain Delon, and it like kind of does a pan, you know, and you don't, it's kind of far away, it's almost detached, you know, almost as detached as Alain Delon is in, you know, demeanor and shit. But above all, like the film looks good, you know, it's really badass, but honestly, it ain't really nothing we haven't seen a million times before, you know, and a million times after. And honestly, you know, I think Walter Hill did it a lot better in The Driver. You know, there's not a lot of heart to this film. It's very stone cold mechanic, but you can't really take that away from this film because, you know, it was intentionally done that way, you know, because it had to mirror the protagonist of the film. But then we move forward to Luc Besson's Leon the Professional, starring the great Jean Reno. And of course, Luc Besson was another French filmmaker who, you know, he didn't only do gangster movies, but he is most known for his gangster films. And of course, before Leon the Professional, he had the great La Femme Nikita, and the Leon the Professional is kind of his follow up to that, you know. And Jean Reno is in both films, you know, but here he's the main character, the titular character as well. And you know, of course, he's a hitman. You know, he works for an Italian the great Danny Aiello, who in a rare performance where he's not playing an asshole, he's actually pretty chill for a Danny Aiello performance. And, that opening sequence is way fucking better than Lay Samurai because, dude, that motherfucker, like the action choreography, because Luc Besson was like somewhere in the middle, like timeline wise, of action filmmakers in between John Woo and Robert Rodriguez. They all kind of like were one right after the other and stuff, because unlike Leon the Professional, came out a couple of years after Hard Boiled and in like a year before Desperado, and like there was just a whole string of like great action movies that you would see in the 90s. That's one thing the 90s were exceptional at, is just fucking action, balls to the wall action movies. And of course, you can shit on action movies all you want to, but one thing that makes an action movie great is the choreography. If you block a good shootout or a fist fight or whatever, like, crazy ass shit you're gonna put in there, it can almost be better than the fucking like ballet. I mean, that shit is like fucking poetry, man. Where it's like you see motherfuckers like, shed a tear at a ballet or something because the choreography's so good, but really appreciate like a John Woo, Luc Besson, or a Robert Rodriguez movie where it's like you just see some of the best action choreography, and it is cinematic poetry, my friends. And of course, the real like conflict of the film starts out when his neighbor down the hall, where he in the apartment complex that he lives in, Natalie Portman, in one of her early roles. And the thing about Natalie Portman, that she's one of the greatest actors of all time, and she had been doing that shit since she was basically in diapers, and had it early on. The thing about it is with the French too is like they're really good at getting great performances out of young kids and stuff. A whole history to go all the way back to Jean-Pierre Léaud in the 400 Blows. I mean, the most kid performances are annoying as hell. In a French movie, they're not, because that's how fucking good the French are at making movies. Like I said, say what you will about the French, but the motherfuckers can make great art, And but her family, the real piece of shit. Like her father's a scumbag, drug dealer and shit. Her mother's a whore and her sister's a bitch. She is in a real shitty situation. And like the only person outside of her 4-year-old brother that shows her any sort of kindness is her mysterious neighbor Leon, and she didn't know what the fuck he does. He all she knows about him is that the dude drinks a lot of milk. You know, then enter Gary Oldman, Goat Oldman. I mean, Gary Oldman, fuck, one of the greatest actors, not only of his generation, but of all time. I mean, this motherfucker can play anything. And he was especially great when he could ham it up as a villain. And he is one of the best villains ever in this film. We see him with his whole crew. You think he's a fucking gangster and shit, because he's hassling the dude, her dad, about some fucking dope that he cut and stuff. And so they fucking come back and they fucking shoot up the whole place and shit. But, while all this shit's going on, fucking Natalie Portman's out getting groceries and shit. And then she comes back and sees all this fucking shit that just went down. And so she goes to Leon's apartment, and, he reluctantly lets her in. But the moment he lets her in, he basically saves her life. And then they start a little journey. He's basically, it's one of those things. That's where, like, a lot of motherfuckers might have, especially this day and age with the climate and shit, with all the pederasses and shit, motherfuckers might want to pick apart something like this. But let me be clear about that whole dynamic of Leon and Matilda. If you really want to fucking like go after a fucking French film for being awkward with an older dude and a really young girl, go after something like Sundays in Seville, or fucking but mainly just that one. There's a, or even not just that dynamic, but just adults and children. Look at Murmur of the Heart, or even fucking an American film directed by a French director, fucking Pretty Baby. Go after those fucking films, because the thing about Leon the Professional, the relationship between Leon and Matilda is very platonic. Like, he has no sexual feelings towards her, and even if she acts like she has sexual feelings towards him, it's because she's a very confused kid. Like I said, she's in a fucking shitty ass family. She's got a shithead for a father, a whore for a stepmother, not even a real mother. Real mother either just ran away or is fucking dead. That's not fully explained. A bitch for a half sister. And the only, like I said, the only person that outside of her 4-year-old brother that showed her any kindness was Leon. And so she doesn't know what real love is. And so, like, she mistakes kindness for sex and all the and love and all that shit, and then he also trains her to be a hitman, in his eyes it's kind of like a daughter to him, he's like her protector, like he does shit that he wouldn't normally fucking do. I mean, all this motherfucker ever did outside of killing motherfuckers was, water his peace lily and watch Gene Kelly movies, and now like he wants to help her out, even though like he doesn't know how to really show true emotion. Like he takes out that cop and stuff, and that also sets it into motion where, like, because she tries to kill Gary Oldman and that doesn't work out. Then he ends up rescuing her, but then they bring a whole goddamn SWAT team to take Leon out and shit. And, he gets most of them. And, they get him because Gary Oldman shoots him in the fucking back. But you know what? He gets him at the end with that fucking grenade. And it's like, this is from Matilda. Blows that motherfucker up. Beautiful. Perfect ending. And then Matilda goes and, of course, Danny Aiello's got the money for her and shit. And, she's going to go to school. She's going to start her shit right, and who knows, maybe later on she becomes a fucking hitman. That's one sequel in a world full of sequels that nobody fucking asked for. That would have been a cool fucking sequel, maybe Natalie Portman, well, I don't know, she still looks great, so she could still like be, younger or older or whatever the fuck, however the hell you wanted to make a fucking sequel to that movie, because, she looks like she doesn't age anyways. So this round clearly has to go to Leon the Professional. One, because the acting is way fucking better. Like I said, the acting in Les Samurai is very mechanical and bland. Granted, it was meant to be that way, but you know what? Jean Reno is a way better actor than Alain Delon. And, it emotes more fucking emotion and shit. And, of course, like Gary Oldman, by himself is a way better villain than all the fucking, like, backroom Frenchman gangster motherfuckers in Les Samurai and shit. And of course, like, you may argue, like, his little fucking weird crew, like, what the fuck is up with that Rastafarian dude? That's fucking weird. But I mean, that's so minuscule in the movie because it's like mostly it's Gary Oldman's show chewing the fucking scenery when it comes to the villain shit. And of course, Natalie Portman, one of the greatest actors of all time, and give one of the greatest kid performances. It's a really beautiful movie, a lot of heart to it, very entertaining. The action in it is fucking great. A great montage when he's training her to be an assassin and shit. And and the dialogue's really good too. Like I said, it's just a way better fucking movie. So for anybody keeping score, that is 94 to 74. 70s are only up by 20 now. Because here's the thing, man. I mean, they had a lot of great action movies in the 70s, but the 90s, if we're saying one thing that the 90s were great at, it was fucking action movies. Because you had guys like Luc Besson, like, in their prime, doing some of the fucking most badass fucking movies you could ever wish to see. So if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. I really don't give a fuck. This is one asshole's opinion on a very long, self-indulgent journey to see which decade was better for movies, the 70s or the 90s. Now, my money's still on the 70s, but like I said, them 90s keep coming back with a few 1-2 punches. So I'll be doing this shit until I'm satisfied with it. And who the hell knows when that is, because I sure as hell don't. So you better watch your ass, because you never know who's going to be lurking.